Hi, my name's Kenny Smith. I'm a reader at the Language Evolution Group at the University of Edinburgh.
Hi, my name's Dr. Sweelin Lavelle, and I'm a lecturer in philosophy at the School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. We're here today because we want to tell you a little bit about human cognition, and in particular, how human brains and human cognitive structures evolved. There's a really old debate in philosophy which can be traced back to Plato's Meno dialogues, possibly even earlier, about whether we can have knowledge which isn't learned, or whether all our knowledge comes from experience of the world. Much later, the philosopher John Locke argued that the mind had to be a blank slate and that all the knowledge that we have comes from experience, comes from living in the world. And he was challenged by Gottfried Leibniz, who said, no, there have to be some structures, some kind of knowledge that we have that isn't learned. Now, no one takes an extreme view of these positions these days. No one thinks that that all our knowledge isn't learned, or that all our knowledge comes from experience. And what we'd like to talk you through today is how this debate has evolved. I'm going to introduce a view called evolutionary psychology, which says that we have lots of knowledge which isn't learned, and that we can support this by appeal to theories of natural selection. Then I'll hand over to Kenny.
And I'm going to focus on social learning and culture, and in particular I'm going to argue that lots of interesting human behaviours, including really important ones like language, can be explained as a product of culture and cultural evolution.
Natural selection is a really complex concept, and unfortunately we don't have time to go through today all the different interpretations of the view. If you'd like to find out more about what natural selection is, you can take a look at some of the further readings at the end of this module. For our purposes though, we're going to think of natural selection as a process of environmental filtering. The environment filters out those organisms which are least suited to living in it. Biologists frequently talk about organisms as having adaptations. Adaptations are physical features or behavioural traits that an organism has as a result of natural selection. In order for a trait to be a product of natural selection, it needs to be the case that the trait is heritable. There also needs to be variation in the population, some organisms which have the trait and some which don't. Finally, a trait needs to be advantageous to the organism's reproductive or survival success in order to count as an adaptation.
The reason that beavers need physical and behavioural adaptations for living in water is of course that they spend a lot of time in the water. While lots of mammals live like this, beavers are unusual in that they create their own wet areas. They build dams which block rivers and expand the wet areas that they like to live in. Dam building in beavers is the product of a suite of physical and behavioural adaptations. They have big, rugged teeth which they use to cut down trees. They can then eat the leaves, bud and bark from the tree, that's what they live on, and they can add the tree trunk to their dam. And they have a damming instinct. They're stimulated to dam by the sound of water running over obstacles. The interesting thing about beavers is that these adaptations are in response to an environment which they themselves have helped to create and shape. Their various adaptations for living in water are selected for in part because they actively change their environment, flooding it, increasing the area that's underwater, and increasing the advantages that these adaptations provide. As well as increasing these selection pressures, damming reduces other selective pressures. For instance, flooding large areas where they can forage for food minimises the time they have to spend out of the water, reducing the danger they face from predators. Like many other species, beavers therefore shape the selective pressures that act on them. They adapt to their environment, but they also change their environment, and therefore change the pressures they adapt to. Later on, I'll talk about how humans do the same thing, but on a much grander scale.
Some adaptations are easy to spot. Take the mammalian heart, for example. In the 16th century, the biologist William Harvey discovered that the heart pumps blood around the body. Biologists now consider the heart to be an adaptation. Those mammals which had hearts that efficiently pumped blood around the body did better than those mammals which had hearts which were less efficient at pumping blood. So it's uncontroversial to think of certain organs and parts of our bodies in adaptive terms. So, how should we understand the evolution of our cognitive capacities? Cognitive traits like the ability to do sums, or the ability to read, or even the ability to recognise the face of a loved one, are much more difficult to determine than something like the valves of a heart. We can look at the physiology of the brain, but that only really tells us a fraction of the story of how our cognitive traits evolved. Moreover, cognitive traits like the ability to do maths don't leave any mark on the fossil record. So, can we use the same techniques of natural selection and adaptation that we use to understand the evolution of physical and behavioural traits to understand the evolution of our cognitive traits? There's an ongoing debate in cognitive science about how much of our brain is a product of natural selection and how much of it is a product of social learning. These are not all or nothing claims. So no one thinks that all of the brain is a product of natural selection or that it's all a product of social learning. But what we're going to look at now is a view called evolutionary psychology, which maintains that most of our cognitive capacities are there as a result of natural selection. The 4 claims of evolutionary psychology are these. First, the human brain is a product of natural selection. Second, the human brain adapted to solve particular problems which our ancestors faced. Third, the cognitive capacities which our ancestors developed that allowed them to solve problems were heritable. They could be transmitted biologically from parent to offspring. Fourth, the brains we have now are the brains which our ancestors evolved all those years ago. Of course, it's possible to endorse the view that the brain is a product of natural selection without being committed to the 4 claims of evolutionary psychology. Kenny's going to talk you through an alternative later, based on social learning. The argument isn't about whether natural selection was involved. The argument is about how we should understand the role of natural selection in shaping the human brain. If there were to be a slogan for the evolutionary psychology movement, it would be that our modern skulls house Stone Age minds. This was a term that was coined by Lina Cosmides and John Tooby, who are commonly acknowledged as the founders of evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychologists point out that the vast majority of our species' history was spent living in small hunter-gatherer groups in the African savanna. So from about 1.8 million years ago to 10,000 years ago, we were living in these small groups in very hot environmental conditions. This is what evolutionary psychologists refer to as the environment of evolutionary adaptation, and they claim that the brains that we have now evolved to solve the problems which this environment of evolutionary adaptation threw up at us. The Industrial Revolution only happened about 200 years ago, and agriculture's been part of our life for about 5,000 years. And so these are just tiny fractions of the human species' history. For about 99% of our history, we were living in the conditions thrown up by the environment of evolutionary adaptation. One of the effects of this, say the evolutionary psychologists, is that some of the cognitive capacities that we have now evolved to suit the conditions and the environment of evolutionary adaptation, but are actually maladaptations. That means that they were very beneficial to us when we were hunter-gatherers, but they're not so beneficial to us in our modern urban environments. For example, craving salt and sugar is a really good cognitive mechanism to have if you're a hominid and you're trying to get really calorific sources of food to feed yourself and your family. But living in an urban environment where sources of salt and fat and sugar are rife, this becomes a maladaptation. Those cravings cause us to eat far too much of those foods and ends up being unhealthy for us. Steven Pinker points this out really nicely when he says that we have a really visceral reaction to snakes and spiders, basically things which would have posed a huge threat for us during the environment of evolutionary adaptation. But in fact, in today's world, snakes and spiders don't really kill very many people per year, in contrast to, say, driving without a seatbelt. Driving without a seatbelt is a much more dangerous thing for humans to be doing in the modern urban environment, but our reaction to this is far less visceral than our reaction to snake bites and spiders. So what were the kind of problems that faced our hominid ancestors? As mentioned before, they lived in small groups of hunter-gatherers. So a lot of the problems that faced our ancestors were to do with group living, how to maintain a harmonious group that could live together. So the evolutionary psychologists maintain that our brains evolved to solve the kinds of problems that faced you if you were living in a small group. For example, Who should I cooperate with to do my hunting and gathering? If I manage to get some food, who should I be sharing it with? Are there people in my group who are benefiting from my work but not contributing to it? Am I feeding lazy people who don't do any hunting and gathering themselves? These are precisely the kind of problem that the evolutionary psychologists maintain our brains evolved to solve. They recur day after day for the 1.8 million years of the environment of evolutionary adaptation. And so it's necessary, say the evolutionary psychologists, that our brains evolved fast and efficient ways of solving these problems. One of the most famous hypotheses from the evolutionary psychologist is that the brain has a part which evolved to solve the cheater detection problem. That is, our brains have got a part which evolved to solve the question of who in my environment is free riding, who's taking stuff without putting back to the community. Here's how they argue for that hypothesis. There's a logic task devised by the psychologist Peter Wason in the 60s, which is intended to test whether people can follow whether a particular logical rule has been broken. We can kind of work it through like this. Imagine that you have a job as a quality control person in a card manufacturer, manufactures cards for games. And you've been told that if a card is yellow on one side, then there needs to be a circle on the other side. Now you've been reassured that every card that you're looking at has a colour and a shape on each side of it, and your job is to check which cards might possibly have broken the rule. So here are the cards, and which ones do you think you need to turn over to ensure that the rule has been kept? So the cards you need to turn over would be the yellow card, because we've been told if it's yellow, then it needs to have a circle on the other side. So we turn over the yellow card, and sure enough, there's a circle on the other side, so the rule has been kept. Now, we don't need to turn over the circle card, because there isn't any rule about if it's a circle, then it has to have a particular colour on the other side. But we do need to turn over the triangle card. We need to turn it over to make sure that it isn't yellow on the other side, because then it will have broken the rule. Oh, this card is yellow on the other side, so this card is dud. It's broken the rule. Let's try a different puzzle. Imagine now that you're a bouncer at a nightclub, and you've been told that in this particular club, you can only drink alcohol if you're aged 21 or over. Now imagine that each of these cards represents a patron at the nightclub, either how old they are or what they're drinking. Which people do you need to check to make sure that the rule has been kept? Well, you obviously need to check what the 16-year-old is drinking to make sure that they're not drinking beer. So we should turn that card over. They're drinking orange juice, so that's okay. But you also need to check the age of the beer drinkers. This person is drinking beer, so we need to make sure that they are 21 or over. Oh, that person is 16, so they're going to get thrown out of the nightclub. How did you fare on these tasks? Most people find the first one significantly more difficult than the second, even people who've taken classes in logic. Cosmides and Tooby take this as evidence for the fact that we have a cognitive adaptation which evolved to allow us to detect cheaters in our environment. We're very good at detecting when a social norm has been violated. But because this part of the brain evolved just to detect the violation of social norms, we can't use it in other situations, even when it would be useful. For example, we can't transfer that ability and use it in an abstract logical setting. So Cosmides and Tooby use this as evidence for the idea that we evolved a particular cognitive ability, the ability to detect cheaters in our environment. The evolutionary psychologists claim that the brain evolved to deal with lots of specific different problems, commits them to a very particular view of how the mind is structured. This is the modular view of the mind. It means that the mind is a series of mini-computers, each of which is specialised to do a particular cognitive task. And in the literature, these mini-computers are referred to as modules, or cognitive modules. So there's a mini-computer that allows us to detect friend from foe, a mini-computer that allows us to do basic mathematical calculations, a mini-computer that can kind of tell us where we are in an environment that deals with spatial cognition. And the evolutionary psychologists say that each mini-computer can only do its job. So think about the body more generally. The lungs are very good at extracting oxygen from the air, and the heart is very good at pumping blood around the body. But if our lungs fail for whatever reason, it's not like the heart can step in and do the work of the lungs. And the same goes for the mini-computers of the brain. The mini-computer that deals with social cognition, that allows you to detect who might be a cheater in your environment, who might be free riding, can also be used to apply to, say, a more abstract mathematical logic problem. So on the evolutionary psychology view, the brain is like a Swiss Army knife. It's a series of mini-computers, each of which is tailored to a specific task. Whereas opponents to evolutionary psychology say the brain is much more like a chef's knife. It has one kind of very good blade, which allows it to do a variety of different things. And it might not do them as well as a specific tool, but it nevertheless gets the job done. Another reason that evolutionary psychologists endorse the modular view of the brain, that is, that the brain consists in a series of mini-computers, has to do with the complexity of the brain. The brain is an incredibly complex organ, and from an evolutionary perspective, it's unlikely that it just popped into existence as a result of one massive adaptation. Instead, it's likely to evolve over millions and millions of years, changing incrementally in tiny steps. Let's look at the human eye as an analogy. Our very distant ancestors, the ones who lived a really long time ago, just in the sea, didn't have eyes as we have them now. They just have light sensors that allow them to detect the difference between light and dark and use that information accordingly. Much later, organisms began to evolve retinas, and then later cones and rods, which allowed them to have a finer color vision. Now, the human eye evolved very incrementally to the eye that we have now, but we can break it down into the separate parts which evolved separately. The advantage of this is that one part of the eye can break or not work properly without the whole thing going down. And that's really important for organisms for whom perception is a really important way of life. This is what happens with color blindness. The parts of the eye which detect color don't work properly. But that doesn't mean that the person is unable to see at all. The rest of the vision functions perfectly normally. It's just that this one component isn't working as it normally does. Now let's return to the human brain. As mentioned before, the brain is probably the most complex organ that we have. And so the evolutionary psychologists say that each module, each mini-computer, evolved semi-independently of the whole, kind of building on the resources of the brain, but without being wholly dependent on it. This is really advantageous because it means that if one computer breaks down, then the whole brain doesn't break down. An organism can't live without a brain, but it can live without one part of its brain, one module, not working properly. And so the idea that we have these modules which only take in a limited amount of information, process it, and kind of spit out a limited amount of information in turn, these little modules which are kind of blind to the overall workings of the entire brain, isn't so implausible after all, say the evolutionary psychologists. Another advantage of thinking of the brain in this way is that natural selection can act upon one module of the brain, for example, improving our spatial cognition, without having to tinker or adjust or change the brain as a whole. It can just work on the spatial cognition module. And so the complexity of the brain and trying to explain how such a complex organ could have evolved is a very strong argument in favor of the modularity of the human mind.
I just want to take a minute to point out another interesting property of beavers and their dams: ecological inheritance. Baby beavers inherit their various physical and behavioural adaptations from their parents through their genes, but they also inherit their environment, the lodge and dam their parents have built, and the flooded land behind it. Some beaver dams are absolutely massive, and they can last for decades, way more than the life of an individual beaver. This therefore constitutes a type of non-genetic inheritance, sometimes called ecological inheritance. As well as giving you their genes, your parents can pass on other stuff to you. If you're a beaver, this includes a dam. Ecological inheritance is rife in humans, of course. Think of all the aspects of your environment that your parents shaped for you, starting with the house that you grew up in. But we also inherit knowledge and behaviours directly from our parents and other people, not via our genes, but via social learning.
The ability to learn, to modify your behaviour in response to your environment, is very widespread in nature. Basically, every organism can do this. Social learning, that's learning from the behaviour of others, is also pretty common. So apes and other primates do it, but other mammals do it too, like rats, and birds do it, and even some fish do it. But humans are definitely the premier social learners. Think of all the things you know and the skills you have that you were taught by another person, or that you copied from someone else, or that you read in a book or saw in a video on YouTube. And on top of ecological inheritance, social learning forms an important non-genetic mechanism for the transmission of knowledge and behaviours in human populations. And I think understanding social learning is crucial to understanding human evolution. Humans have large repertoires of behaviours which are transmitted by social learning, and the collective term for these is culture. So culture informally is often used to refer to highbrow activities like going to the ballet or attending a piano recital. But its technical usage just refers to any system of knowledge and behaviour which is transmitted by teaching, imitation, or other forms of social learning. So culture in humans includes things like the clothes you wear, the kind of house you live in, the food you eat, and the language you speak. And other animals have culture too, because they do social learning. So for instance, different chimpanzee populations have different repertoires of behaviour. So you'll find that some chimpanzee populations crack nuts using a simple hammer and anvil, and other chimpanzee populations, which are otherwise very similar, don't. And this is a cultural difference, rather than, for instance, a genetic difference. Animal cultures are very simple. They look as if a single individual invents a new behaviour, and then it spreads through the population as that animal is copied by others. So the reason that some chimpanzee populations use a hammer and anvil to crack nuts and others don't is just because in the populations where nobody does it, no individual has discovered that behaviour yet. Since different innovations occur in different populations, over time separate populations accumulate their own idiosyncratic inventory of these simple behaviours. Human culture doesn't work like this. Rather than being a collection of simple behaviours and artefacts, human cultures and the products of human culture are enormously complex. So think of how complex a bicycle is, or a car, or a computer, or even your clothes with all the different fabrics and fasteners. Or think of how complex the political and legal institutions are in your country and how they got to be that way. These complex objects and behaviours weren't invented by a single individual who everyone else copied. Rather, they represent the gradual accumulation of modifications over hundreds or thousands of years. You inherit a behaviour, and then you modify it and improve its design, and then you pass on that modified version. And this process, where one generation builds on knowledge inherited from previous generations, is called cumulative culture. And the objects it produces are enormously complex and well designed. So at least some interesting human behaviours and artefacts are products of cumulative culture rather than being biological adaptations.
Remember the beavers and their dams, an instinctive behaviour carried out by the beavers which changed their environment, increasing some selective pressures and reducing others. Humans do exactly the same kind of sculpting and shaping of their environment, but on a massive scale. Unlike beavers, the things we do to shape our environment, things like wearing clothes, building shelter, growing crops and keeping animals for food, living in large, complex social groups, are not instinctive behaviours, but socially learned. They're part of culture, and you learn how to do these things from the people around you. Nonetheless, just like beavers and their dams, all these modifications we make to our environment massively change the selective pressures acting on us. Our ability to insulate ourselves from hostile environments with clothing and housing has allowed us to spread right across the planet and inhabit hostile environments like the high plains of the Andes or the Arctic Circle, which would otherwise be uninhabitable.
As well as insulating us from some selection pressures, our cultural practices have set up new selection pressures acting on human populations. One of the most famous examples is the evolution of lactase persistence. So most mammals lose the ability to process lactose, that's the main carbohydrate in milk, after weaning. There's essentially no need to carry on producing lactase, that's the enzyme that the body uses to break down lactose, after you stop drinking your mother's milk. But in a minority of the world's human population, adults exhibit what's known as lactase persistence. They carry on producing lactase after the point of weaning, and this enables them to break down lactose and therefore benefit from drinking animal milk. This is a very handy ability to have because milk's a great food source. It's rich in protein and fat. Around a third of the world's adult population exhibit lactase persistence, mainly in Northern Europe and North Africa. And the rest of the human population don't exhibit lactase persistence and are just like normal mammals, losing the ability to process lactose after weaning. So why do some of the world's population exhibit lactase persistence? It's clearly a genetic trait, and what's more, it's probably an adaptation, since it's such a handy ability to have. It's thought that lactase persistence evolved really recently in the last 10,000 years in response to the cultural practice of dairying, keeping animals and drinking their milk. Lactase persistence is really common in populations with a long history of dairying, and it's scarce in populations with no dairying tradition. So the idea is that the cultural practice of dairying set up new selection pressures acting on dairying populations, rewarding individuals who were able to drink milk for longer in life and reap the rewards of milk drinking. The genes of these dairying populations responded to this new selection pressure and evolved this capacity for lactase persistence. And this biological adaptation probably fed back into the cultural practice, further promoting the exploitation of dairy products and setting off a mutually reinforcing spiral of gene-culture coevolution. Lactase persistence is probably the most famous case of human genes responding to selection pressures set up by human culture, but it's almost certainly not the only one. Recent estimates based on sophisticated techniques for identifying the hallmarks of selection in human genetic databases suggest that thousands of genes have been under recent selection in the past 40,000 years, probably as a result of selection pressures set up by human cultural practices. So you might think that the human capacity to insulate ourselves from our environment means that natural selection is effectively over for humans, or you might agree with the evolutionary psychologists that we have Stone Age minds and modern skulls. But in fact, this research suggests that the rate of human evolution has actually increased in the last 40,000 years as our genes respond to the new environments we create for ourselves via culture. So let's spend a little bit of time applying these ideas to a problem that I work on, the evolution of language. Human language is a uniquely powerful, flexible communication system that has no parallel in the natural world. Basically, every species communicates. Flowers signal the availability of nectar to bees, and bees communicate with other bees about the location of flower patches. Male birds sing for female birds to advertise their availability and quality. And lots of species have alarm calling systems where they have specific calls to communicate to group members about the presence of specific predators. Now, these are all fascinating communication systems, but compared to human language, they're incredibly rigid and inflexible. An alarm calling monkey can't use its alarm calling system to reminisce about a predator they saw yesterday or to plan what they should do next time they see a predator. And in contrast, human language is incredibly flexible and powerful. Basically anything I can think, I can communicate to you using language, provided you've been able to figure out my accent. Language has a bunch of structural devices which enable it to achieve this open-ended expressive power. And at the most fundamental level, the expressive power of language comes from the fact that it has rules. Speakers of a language know the meaning of a bunch of words, and they implicitly know the rules of that language that govern how those words are combined. And this means that as long as you know the meanings of the words and the rules of the language, then you can understand any sentence that follows those rules. So all of the things that Sweelan and I have said in this lecture today have been completely novel, one-off sentences of English that have never been spoken before and will never be spoken again. And nonetheless, because you implicitly know the rules of English, you've been able to understand what we mean.
Within this basic framework, language provides devices for conveying all kinds of useful information. You can encode who did what to who. In a language like English, you convey this information using the order of words in a sentence. In a language like Hungarian, you do the same job by attaching markers to the end of words. This allows you to distinguish between, for example, the news that the dog chased the cat or the cat chased the dog. You could say when an event happened in time, allowing you to convey whether something already happened, or will happen in the future, or is happening right now. You can convey that an event might happen, or will happen, or might not happen, or won't happen, and you can explain why. You can ask questions that require simple yes-no answers, or request more complex information. How have humans ended up with such a fantastically rich, complex communication system? One possibility is that language and all these grammatical devices for communicating complex information are an adaptation. This argument was made by Steven Pinker and Paul Bloom in a well-known 1990 article called Natural Language and Natural Selection. In their paper, they argued that language is a complex biological trait that appears to be designed for communication. The only way to explain such traits is to appeal to natural selection. Humans live in complex social groups. As Sweelan already said, this means we spend lots of time thinking about social events, like who is cheating on who. But it also means we rely heavily on communicating with other people. Sometimes we want to exchange information about current social events or immediate survival-relevant situations. But we also want to pass on the complex set of knowledge, skills and beliefs that are needed to survive in the world. Language is obviously well designed for doing all these things, and therefore, so the argument goes, the ability to learn a language must be an adaptation.
So it could be that the complexity and communicative power of language are the product of an evolved language instinct, a mini-computer or a series of mini-computers that have specialised for language learning and language processing. And there's clearly something uniquely human involved in language. No other species has a communication system that works like language, and attempts to teach human language to non-human animals have met with only limited success. But in my work, I explore an alternative possibility, the idea that some of the interesting structural properties of language are a product of culture rather than biology. And in particular, I explore the idea that these interesting features of human language are a product of cumulative culture, the gradual accumulation of modifications that I talked about earlier on. So we know for a fact that languages are socially learned. The reason I sound the way I do is that I grew up around a whole group of people who sound like this, and I learned my particular version of English from listening to the way those people talked. And they in turn learned their language in the same way. So your parents were influenced linguistically by their parents and peers, who were in turn influenced by their parents and peers, and so on, in a process of transmission that stretches back tens of thousands, or maybe even hundreds of thousands of years. And we also know that languages change as a result of this transmission process, because we can see it in the written record. So the English of today is very different from the English spoken in Shakespeare's time, and the English spoken 1,000 years ago would be incomprehensible to a modern speaker of English because the language has changed so much. Our historical record for languages doesn't actually stretch back very far. Writing was only invented 5,000 years ago, and as far as we can tell, the first languages to be written down work in basically the same way as modern languages in having rules and structure of the sort that I mentioned before. But languages must have been around a lot longer than 5,000 years. They must have been around as long as there were humans on the planet, and maybe even longer. So that means that languages have a fantastically long period of time to evolve by cumulative culture. And it could be that the complexity and communicative power of language arose as a result of cumulative cultural evolution over this time frame. In order to survive, languages have to be highly learnable. They have to make it into the minds of language learners. Language learners simplify and regularize and generally tidy up languages as they learn them. As a result, languages evolve to have rules and patterns and regularities that language learners can identify and exploit, because those patterns make language more learnable. At the same time, people consciously or unconsciously modify the way they use their language in order to make the distinctions they care about and meet their communicative needs. So for instance, you might choose the most concise or clear or funny or inventive or colloquial way you can think of to express yourself. So people modify their language to meet their communicative needs in much the same way as they modify tools and other cultural products to improve their function. The only difference might be that the modifications we make to language are more subtle and perhaps less intentional. But over hundreds of thousands of years, these changes, in conjunction with the simplifying and systematizing consequences of language learning, might conspire to produce complex, expressive, rule-governed languages. This is just a hypothesis, of course, but I think it's a good one, and it's one we can test. We can't study the early origins of language directly, but we can study how languages are learned in the present and how they change over historical time. And we can simulate these same processes of learning and change, either in a computer or using real people in the experiment lab. If this theory is correct, it means that some of the most important structural features of language, which makes language such a wonderfully powerful and expressive communication system, might be a product of culture rather than a biological adaptation.
We started with the premise that our brains are a product of natural selection. We then looked at two different ways in which we could develop this claim. The first, evolutionary psychology, says that our brains evolved during the environment of evolutionary adaptation about 2.4 million years ago. The brains that we have today are a series of mini-computers, each of which evolved to solve a specific problem that faced our ancestors during the environment of evolutionary adaptation.
The second account suggests that the human brain's undergone significant evolution in the last 10,000 years as a result of our capacity for cumulative culture, which has enabled us to shape our environment to better suit our needs. Culturally transmitted niche constructing behaviours, like dairy farming, have set up new selective pressures and have driven rapid evolution in our genes. Evolutionary psychology paints a relatively passive view of evolution, with the organism responding to challenges imposed by the environment. Niche constructing accounts emphasise how organisms alter their environment, set up new selective pressures. This is of course a caricature of the two positions, but it highlights one of the key differences between them. Humans are unique in our capacity for high fidelity social learning, the sheer amount of social learning we do, and the cumulative culture that this produces. And language clearly plays a pivotal role in setting up these systems of social learning, but again we see differences in the two accounts in how they explain the evolution of language. Evolutionary psychologists will look for a series of language modules in the brain, specialised mini-computers which enable us to learn and process language. Researchers persuaded by the cultural account will instead focus on how languages change and evolve in order to be easier to learn and more expressive to use.
We've only been able to give a short overview of the two main positions in this MOOC, but if you're interested, we've put some further reading on the handout for you to look at. Researchers are really interested in the interaction between evolution and culture, and it remains one of the fiercest and most stimulating debates in cognitive science at present. The mind may not be a blank slate, but we still have a long way to go before we fully understand the nature of knowledge that it contains.
Explaining consciousness is one of the hardest problems in science. This should be surprising because we all know a lot about consciousness from our own experience. You could say that our own consciousness is the thing in the world that we know best. The philosopher Descartes thought that our knowledge of our own conscious thought was more secure than the rest of natural science. He thought that consciousness was unique in that we know with absolute certainty that our own consciousness exists and with the ultimate authority on its character. Yet, despite the seemingly excellent knowledge of our own consciousness, consciousness is one of the most puzzling things in the world. We don't know what it is about us as physical beings that make us conscious. We don't know why we have consciousness, and we don't know which creatures other than ourselves are conscious. Consciousness isn't just a scientific term, it's also a word that appears in everyday life. We might say she wasn't conscious of the passing pedestrian, that he was knocked unconscious in the boxing ring, or that our conscious experience of smelling a rose or hearing a symphony make life worth living. Consciousness is what philosophers call a folk concept, a concept that arises out of and is ingrained into our everyday interests. A scientific understanding of consciousness should approach our folk talk about consciousness with a great deal of care. What sort of things might folk mean when they talk about consciousness in their everyday life? One thing we might mean by consciousness is simply sentience. When we say that a creature's conscious, all that we mean is that it acts in an intelligent way and it's responsive to its environment. We might, for example, say that the spider under the fridge is conscious of our presence. All we mean is that the spider's aware that we're here and has sensibly taken evasive action. A second and distinct meaning of consciousness is wakefulness. When we say someone is conscious, what we mean is that they're awake, they're not asleep or otherwise incapacitated. This sense of consciousness suggests that consciousness is a global state, a kind of switch that affects the whole of the mental life of the organism. A third thing we might mean by consciousness is what the philosopher Ned Block has called access consciousness. A thought is access conscious if it's broadcast widely in a creature's brain and is poised to interact with a wide variety of the creature's other thoughts and to directly drive its behaviour. Access conscious thoughts are usually the ones that you can report if someone were to ask you, "What are you thinking now?" Remarkably, not all of our thoughts are access conscious. It's one of the most surprising and well-confirmed findings of 20th century psychology that the majority of our mental life is not access conscious. Our access conscious thoughts are only the tip of the iceberg in our mental life. A fourth thing we might mean by consciousness is phenomenal consciousness, or qualia. To understand this, imagine taking a God's eye view of your mental life. At any given moment, there's a lot going on in your head. You have beliefs that Paris is the capital of France, desires to eat lunch soon. You make plans to go to the cinema tonight, and those plans result in motor action, turning the handle of your front door. You perceive that there's a computer in front of you, and you make perceptual discriminations between the screen and the keyboard of the computer. But in addition to all this activity, there's something else going on. Your mental life isn't just information processing, discriminations, forming plans, making judgments. It's also accompanied by subjective feelings. Imagine that someone were to place a piece of dark chocolate on your tongue. Now imagine instead that that person were to put a breath mint on your tongue. You could, of course, tell the difference between these two environmental stimuli. You could discriminate between them. But we could build a machine to do that too. There's more going on in your case. It's not just that you can tell the difference between the two stimuli. It's these two stimuli elicit different conscious feelings in you. It feels a certain way when you taste chocolate, and it feels a certain way when you taste a mint, and those two feelings are different. These conscious feelings that accompany many episodes in our mental life are what's meant by phenomenal consciousness, or qualia. Things we might mean by consciousness include sentience, wakefulness, access consciousness, and phenomenal consciousness. For any of these different forms of consciousness, one might ask the questions with which we started. What is it about us as physical beings that make us conscious? Why are we conscious? And which creatures other than ourselves are conscious? Some of these questions turn out to be easier than others to answer. For example, we're making good progress at explaining what it is about us as physical beings that make us either awake or asleep. One set of questions, those concerning phenomenal consciousness, have turned out to be incredibly difficult to answer. These questions centre around what's been called the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is to explain how creatures such as ourselves have phenomenal consciousness. What is it about us as physical beings that produces phenomenal consciousness? Think of yourself from two different angles. From the subjective point of view, your own introspective take on your own mental life, you know that you've got phenomenal consciousness. You know that you've got conscious feelings, and that those feelings come in many different kinds. Philosophers use the expression, what it's like, as a way of referring to conscious experiences that occur when we do a particular activity. We might say, what it's like to snub one's toe, or what it's like to eat a raw chili. In each case, what we mean is the conscious feeling that usually comes on when we do that activity. Reflecting on our conscious experience using what it's like talk reveals that we already know a great deal about phenomenal consciousness. We know, for example, that what it's like to taste chocolate is different from what it's like to taste mint. We know that what it's like to taste a clementine is similar to what it's like to taste an orange. Phenomenal consciousness has a definite structure, and our conscious feelings bear relations of similarity and difference to each other. Reflecting on our conscious life from a subjective point of view via introspection is called phenomenology. Now imagine viewing yourself as an object from the outside. From this point of view, it seems surprising that you have phenomenal consciousness at all. If we didn't know it already from our own experience, we would never have guessed it. Think about your brain as a physical object. Your brain is made up of over 100 billion neurons wired in a complex web. We know that your brain stores information, discriminates between stimuli, and controls your behaviour. But we've no idea how your brain produces conscious feelings. We know that we have phenomenal consciousness and that our phenomenal consciousness has a rich structure, but we've no idea how brain activity produces produces phenomenal consciousness. This is the hard problem of consciousness, explaining how brain activity produces conscious feelings. Why is the hard problem of consciousness so hard? One difficulty is that there's a gap between our two perspectives on consciousness, phenomenology and brain science. Both seem to be legitimate sources of knowledge about our mental life. The difficulty is linking them together. Science has an impressive track record at unifying our knowledge. A common pattern in science is to unify by reductive explanation, by explaining high-level phenomena in terms of low-level phenomena. For example, in the kinetic theory of gases, high-level phenomena involving the pressure and temperature of the gas are explained in terms of low-level laws and mechanisms involving the constituent molecules of the gas. But both pressure, temperature, and the movements of the constituent molecules are all known from the third-person point of view. The puzzle with phenomenal consciousness is to explain how our first-person conscious feelings arise out of third-person accessible brain activity. There's no precedent in science for this kind of reductive explanation. In fact, a number of philosophers, including Frank Jackson, David Chalmers, and Thomas Nagel, have argued that science will never reductively explain phenomenal consciousness in terms of brain activity. We'll never solve the hard problem of consciousness. Let's look at Frank Jackson's argument for this claim. Frank Jackson's argument is based around a thought experiment. Imagine that a brilliant neuroscientist, Mary, is born and grows up inside a black and white room. Mary's never seen colour, but she's fascinated by how the human brain detects and processes colour. Inside her room, Mary's provided with encyclopedias that describe the workings of the human brain. These encyclopedias don't just contain current knowledge in neuroscience. They include every fact that there is to know about how the human brain works. From her encyclopedias, Mary learns in exquisite detail how the human brain detects and processes colour information. One day Mary's released from the room. When she goes outside, she spots a red rose and she experiences seeing colour for the first time. Jackson claims that at this moment Mary learns something new about human vision. Previously, Mary knew about how the human brain processes colour. Now Mary also learns about the subjective feelings that accompany seeing colour, the distinctive conscious feeling of seeing red. This conscious feeling is not something that Mary could have predicted based on her books alone. Mary needed to go outside the room and experience seeing colour herself to learn about this fact about the human visual system. Solving the hard problem of consciousness requires showing how every aspect of phenomenal consciousness is determined by brain activity. Mary's predicament appears to show that we'll never achieve this. Mary knows all there is to know about how the human brain works, yet the facts about phenomenal consciousness still elude her. This means that even if we were lucky enough, like Mary, to have a completed neuroscience, we would still be stuck with the hard problem of consciousness. We would still not know how conscious feelings arise from brain activity. Mary doesn't know this, so future neuroscientists wouldn't know it either. No matter how much neuroscience progresses, we would still be stuck with a hard problem of consciousness. Mary's predicament appears to show that we're stuck with our two different perspectives on conscious experience. The project of reducing phenomenology to brain science is doomed to failure.
Hi, I'm David Carmel. I'm a lecturer in psychology at the University of Edinburgh. In the first part of this lecture, Mark Spivak talked about philosophical approaches to consciousness. In this second part, I'll be talking about scientific investigations. So what sorts of questions do scientists ask when we investigate consciousness? And how much progress have we made in turning these questions from philosophical musings into issues that can be investigated empirically? The most fundamental question is, how is it that the activity of a physical system, the brain, can create consciousness and subjective experience in the first place? As we saw earlier, this is known as the hard problem, and science is no closer than it has ever been to being able to answer it. The problem is that we don't know what an answer would look like. We don't have the ways of thinking or the conceptual framework to answer such a question. It may be staring us in the face and we just don't recognize it. Other major questions are considered easy questions, but it's important to be clear about what we mean by easy in this case. It's not that these questions are easy to solve, but rather that it would be easy for us to recognize an answer if and when we ever found one, and we have some idea of how to go about this. The two questions that scientists are most interested in these days both fall under the heading Neural Correlates of Consciousness, or NCC for short. Both questions are concerned with what kinds of neural activity correlate with, happen at the same time as, processes related to consciousness. The first of these asks what neural activity determines the state or level of consciousness that a person is in. What kind of activity determines whether we are awake or asleep, in a coma or in a vegetative state, and so on. The second question asks what processes determine the content of our consciousness, our momentary awareness of ourselves and of the world around us at any given time. A lot of recent research has focused on perceptual awareness, discovering what links the information coming into our brain through our senses with what we become aware of. How does brain activity give rise to different states of consciousness? Let's start by examining what states exist. It's useful to think of one's state of consciousness as a combination of two factors: wakefulness, or what one's level of consciousness is, and awareness, having conscious content. Our level of wakefulness determines whether we're awake or not. Our awareness is our capacity to think, feel, and perceive our environment and ourselves. It's what enables us to interact with the world in a meaningful way. It may seem strange to divide attention into these two separate factors, but as we'll see, it's useful. Right now you're fully awake, or at least I hope you are. So you're at the high end of the scale for both wakefulness and awareness. When you fall asleep tonight, you'll first become drowsy and eventually fall into a deep sleep where both your wakefulness and awareness will be low. For people under anesthesia or in a coma, awareness and wakefulness are reduced even further. If these were the only states that existed, we wouldn't need two separate axes to describe them. They'd all fall along a single line. However, there are cases where the two axes are dissociated. One is high while the other is low. The most obvious example is dreaming, where wakefulness is low because the person is asleep, and awareness is high. The person experiences feelings, sensations, and thoughts. In the rare condition of lucid dreaming, people are even aware that they are in a dream. Unfortunately, there are also clinical conditions known collectively as disorders of consciousness, where brain injury leads to high wakefulness and low awareness at the same time. These conditions include the vegetative state and the minimally conscious state. Patients in the vegetative state have normal sleep-wake cycles, but when they're awake with their eyes open, they don't respond to their environment and don't interact with it in any way that would indicate they're aware of what's going on around them. Sometimes these patients' condition improves and they are reclassified as being in a minimally conscious state, indicating that they sometimes show limited responsiveness to their environment. What sorts of brain activity determine one's state of consciousness? There's no single brain area whose activity is solely responsible for either awareness or wakefulness. The brain is a vastly integrated system, and a person's state of consciousness is the outcome of many subsystems' combined activity. There are, however, certain brain areas whose activity contributes to specific aspects of consciousness. Wakefulness is highly dependent on activity in subcortical structures. So to see what I mean, here's a little model of a brain. The cortex is the outer layer, and if we look at the inside, subcortical structures lie deep below the cortex. The areas involved in wakefulness include the reticular formation and the thalamus, which is right here in the middle. And these are evolutionarily ancient regions. The reticular formation and the thalamus are involved in diverse functions, amongst them the regulation of arousal and sleep-wake cycles. Damage to these areas can cause disorders of consciousness, such as a coma or a vegetative state, but those conditions can also arise from damage to a variety of other brain areas. Unlike wakefulness, which, as we said, is dependent mostly on subcortical functions, awareness is mostly dependent on activity in the cortex. The cortex is a relatively recent evolutionary development and is responsible for higher mental functions in humans. Awareness can be divided into two complementary elements. The first is external awareness, the awareness we have whenever we navigate through the environment and interact with it. This awareness is largely dependent on activity in the frontal and parietal lobes of the cortex, roughly speaking, the areas that are on the upper outer surface of the brain. The second element of awareness is the kind that occurs when we're not focused on the external environment, but on our internal world, daydreaming, retrieving memories, or planning for the future. This kind of awareness depends on a network of regions that are on the medial side of the brain, that is, the side where the two hemispheres of the brain face each other. When we're awake, we're usually either focusing on something in our external environment or directing our attention inward. It's rare, and some would say impossible, to be doing both things at the same time. It's therefore unsurprising that the activity of the two networks involved in awareness is negatively correlated. That is, when either one of them is high, the other is low. Changes in wakefulness, which as we saw are governed by subcortical structures, affect activity in the cortex too. While we're awake, different areas of the cortex busily communicate with one another. As we fall asleep, these areas' communication with each other is reduced. The most sharp reduction occurs between areas of the frontal and posterior or back part of the cortex. The physical connections between these areas still exist, but as we fall asleep, they communicate with each other less and less. So far, we've focused on states of consciousness and the brain activity that underlies them. But as we mentioned earlier, researchers are also interested in the processes that determine the content of our consciousness at any given time, our perceptual awareness. One question we can ask is just how much of the world around us we're actually aware of. Although normally we think we're aware of many of the different things around us, research shows that at any given time we're actually aware of a surprisingly small subset of the information entering our brain through our senses. There are many great demonstrations that attest to the limitations of our awareness. If you want to experience this for yourself, click on the following YouTube videos. These include demonstrations by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris. Make sure you follow the instructions. Did those demonstrations work for you? The phenomenon these videos demonstrate is called inattentional blindness, and its very existence attests to the intimate link between awareness and attention. Hundreds of studies have looked at inattentional blindness in an effort to figure out what we will see and what we will miss, and what factors affect those things. As we just saw, one of the relevant factors seems to be our attentional set, what we happen to be looking for. The chances of missing something that we're not looking for are greater. Another relevant factor seems to be the capacity limits of our visual working memory. That's the store of visual information that's available for our immediate use. Researchers have examined how many elements can appear in a picture before people start missing things. Now, it depends on the exact object and on the type of change that happens, but in most cases, the number isn't large at all. It's limited to about 4 elements. We now turn to the processes that shape our awareness of the things we do perceive. To investigate this, researchers often use something called bistable images. The most well-known example of a bistable image is the Necker cube, which can be perceived as if one side of it is in front or as if the other side of it is in front. The Necker cube has all 3 hallmarks of a bistable image. First of all, it has 2 possible conscious interpretations. Second, you can't see both interpretations at the same time. Try it. And third, these interpretations tend to alternate every few seconds. Another famous example of a bistable image is the Rubin face vase, where you can see the same image either as 2 faces facing each other or as a single vase. Why are bistable images so useful to consciousness researchers? Well, what we have here is a case of dissociation between perception and awareness. The external stimulus, the thing that's out there in the world, does not change, yet our perception does change. Since the only change is happening in our own brains, if we understood the process that causes this to happen, we would have a window into how the brain selects content for representation in consciousness. Several kinds of bistable image have been used in neuroimaging research, where researchers have looked to see which areas of the brain would be active at the same time as perceptual switches. Repeatedly, researchers have found time-locked activity where brain areas were active at the same time as a perceptual switch, not only in visual areas of the brain, which are in the occipital lobe, way back here, but also in frontal and parietal regions of the brain, areas we've mentioned before as related to external awareness. So can we conclude that this frontal and parietal activity causes the changes in perception? Not so fast. Just because something happens at the brain at the same time as a perceptual event, such as a switch in a bistable image, that doesn't mean this activity causes that change. We know that it correlates with the change, we know that it happens at the same time as the change, but correlation is not causation. It could be that this brain activity is involved in noticing that the change has occurred at the same time that it's occurring. It could also be that something else, like activity in a completely different brain area, is causing both the change in perception and the activity in frontal and parietal cortex. If a certain brain region has a causal influence, then actively manipulating its activity will cause changes in perception. That's what we need to do to infer causality. To do this, to manipulate brain activity, researchers often use a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS for short. We do it in places like this, the University of Edinburgh's TMS lab. TMS works by applying a brief, powerful magnetic pulse to the surface of the head, and this interferes temporarily with the activity of the area of cortex right underneath it. So to demonstrate that, I've got Swilin here, who's going to help me by applying TMS to my Broca's area. That's the area in the left side of my brain that produces speech. So we're going to see if applying TMS to my Broca's area can interfere with my speech production. So I'm going to count up, and when I reach 5, Swilin, please press the button. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So yes, TMS interfered with my speech production, and this is how we learn about brain activity, by interfering with activity in specific areas and seeing what kind of function gets interfered with. So applying TMS to Broca's area, the way we did just now, that has immediate functional consequences. We can see what the activation does. But not every bit of the brain that we apply TMS to will have immediate observable consequences. And sometimes we want to apply TMS to an area where we won't see immediately that something jumps or something changes, just to see what kinds of effects this has on things like perception. So a number of researchers have applied TMS to parietal cortex, that's up here, in order to see what kind of effect this has on bistable perception. Surprisingly, it turns out that different parts of parietal cortex play a different role in bistable perception. Applying TMS to certain parts of parietal cortex makes the switching a lot slower, and applying TMS to slightly different parts of parietal cortex has the opposite effect, making switches faster. So we now know that parietal cortex is definitely causally involved in bistable perception, but we still need to figure out what role exactly each of these different areas within parietal cortex plays, and how the neural system as a whole reaches a consensus about what we're seeing. To understand consciousness, we need to know the difference between processes that require awareness and those that don't. If we can perceive something without awareness, that tells us awareness is not necessary for that kind of perception. It therefore narrows down the list of the processes that awareness is necessary for. So how do we investigate unconscious perception? Researchers have developed various ways of showing people things that enter the eyes but don't reach people's awareness. This is different from showing people things that they don't notice because they're not paying attention, as we saw earlier with inattentional blindness. It's also different from visual illusions, which distort perception. What we're talking about here is showing people things but actively suppressing them from awareness. Here we'll talk about one widely used technique as an example. This technique is backward visual masking, where one image is shown very briefly and it's followed immediately after by another image at the same location presented for longer. When this is done right, people can't report the first of the two images and often deny that it was there at all. One of the first studies to use backward masking to investigate unconscious perception employed a method called mask priming. People were shown a single word followed immediately by a mask that was a meaningless pattern. After each such presentation, they were shown a string of letters and they had to decide whether it was a real word or not. Interestingly, people were faster to detect real words when they were semantically related to the word that had been masked than when it was not. For example, if the masked word was infant, people would then be faster to recognize the word child than they would to recognize the word orange. This indicated that the masked word had activated a semantic network in the brain and that the masked word had been processed deeply enough to enable faster recognition of related words. And this priming effect was just as large without awareness as with it. In recent brain imaging work, researchers have shown that masked words activate visual areas of the brain more than meaningless strings of letters do, even when people remain unaware of the masked words. However, unmasked words activate many more regions of the brain, and these areas communicate with each other much more when the words are unmasked. In this lecture, we have examined several of the philosophical and scientific current approaches to consciousness. At this point, there is no theory that offers a full unified account of consciousness and how it arises from the activity of physical systems. Current theories offer agendas for future research, what themes and what issues we should be following if we want to reach an understanding of consciousness. But only time will tell which ones of these themes and which ones of these directions will turn out to be fruitful, and only time will tell how much progress we will make.
We can build computers that do amazing things. An exciting recent development is a new field called machine learning. Machine learning aims to create machines that can learn from their experiences. Remarkably, machine learning appears to hold the key to understanding how our own brains work. In this section, we're going to explore this exciting new field and some of the questions that it raises. Intelligent machines are all around us. They power our search engines, they filter our email for spam, they suggest things that we might like to buy or like to see, they drive cars, and they even explore other planets for us. None of these tasks is easy. To solve them, a machine needs to not only follow rules, but also recognize patterns and react quickly to new information. Our machines are able to do this courtesy of a brilliant idea: computation. A computation is a way of solving a problem by following a set of instructions or a recipe called an algorithm. An algorithm tells a machine how to solve its problem by taking a series of small steps. The steps are usually very simple, such as adding 1 or checking if two numbers are the same. But when many small simple steps are joined together, the result can be behavior that's both complex and intelligent. The father of our modern idea of computation is Alan Turing. Alan Turing was an English mathematician who lived from 1912 to 1954. Turing was obsessed with the project of trying to create an intelligent machine. Turing discovered what he thought was the key to this in his most famous mathematical paper. In that paper, Turing discovered what's now known as a universal computing machine. A universal computing machine is a machine that, if given the right instructions, can replace any other computer. That might sound like an incredible proposal, a single machine that could replace any other computing machine, not just on the planet now, but any other computing machine that could possibly be built. You might guess that if a universal computing machine exists at all, it would have to be a fantastically complex device. Alan Turing showed something that nobody had guessed. It's relatively easy to build a universal computing machine. The universal computing machine that Turing described is known today as the Universal Turing Machine. The Universal Turing Machine consists of a long paper tape and a head that can scan along the tape and read and write symbols guided by a simple set of instructions. If given the right set of instructions, the right algorithm, a Universal Turing Machine can mimic, it can reproduce the behavior of any possible computing machine. So it seems that the problem of producing intelligent behavior is now reduced to simply the problem of finding the right kind of algorithm. But what kind of algorithm produces intelligent behaviour? For many years, attention focused on algorithms that involved language-like symbols and rules, the sort of thing that you might see if you tried to write down in English instructions on how to create intelligent behaviour. More recently, attention's focused on algorithms that do not involve language-like rules and symbols. These algorithms manipulate distributed patterns of activity in a network inspired by the human brain, so-called connectionist networks. Today, the algorithms that hold the most promise for generating intelligent behaviour are probabilistic algorithms. Probabilistic algorithms allow a system to represent not only a range of different outcomes, but also the system's uncertainty about those outcomes. The system may represent not only that there's a tiger lurking around the corner, but also how uncertain the system is about this. One of the great virtues of probabilistic algorithms, as we'll see later, is that they allow a system to learn from experience using a simple principle called Bayes' rule. The idea of computing allows us to build intelligent machines, but it also suggests a new way of thinking about ourselves. If performing the right computation is the way to make a machine intelligent, perhaps that's also what makes us humans intelligent. Perhaps computation is not just a useful engineering tool, but also the key to explaining how the human brain works. Let's unpack the idea that computation could help us to explain the human brain. In the 1970s, a brilliant young cognitive scientist called David Marr said that computation could help us to answer 3 different questions about the brain. First, which task does the brain solve? Second, how does the brain solve that task? Third, why is that task important for the brain to solve? Marr grouped these 3 questions into 3 different levels of computational description. Let's look at each of these levels of description in turn. Rather confusingly, Marr called his first level of description the computational level. The computational level for Marr covers 2 things. First, which task does the brain solve? And second, why is that task important for the brain to solve? Let's use a thought experiment to understand the computational level better. Imagine that one day you discover in your granny's attic a mysterious device. The device has buttons, dials and levers, and you don't know what any of it does. However, you remember that Granny used the device when she was balancing her checkbook. You play around with the device and you notice a pattern. If you dial 2 numbers into the device, it appears to display something that stands for their sum. Balancing a checkbook requires adding numbers. Therefore, it seems reasonable to think that the task Granny's device solves is that of computing the addition function. In Marr's terms, this is a computational level description of Granny's device. It's a description of which mathematical function, addition, subtraction, multiplication, the device computes. Notice that in order to answer this which question, we had to answer a why question. Why was Granny using the device? Without some guess as to a device's intended purpose, in this case balancing a checkbook, we would have no way of picking out from the vast number of physical things a device does, which are relevant to solving its task. This is why Marr groups his which and why questions together. Both fall under what he calls the computational level description of the device. Marr's second level of description is called the algorithmic level. The algorithmic level concerns how the device solves its task. There are many different algorithms that compute the addition function. Without further investigation, all we know is that Granny's device is using one of them. Different algorithms would involve the device taking different steps or taking its steps in different orders. Some algorithms are faster than others and some use less memory. How do we know which algorithm Granny's device is using? A good start is to try and find out the basic steps that Granny's device can take, how long it takes to execute a single step and how much memory it has. Once we know these basic building blocks, we can start to form hypotheses about which algorithm it's using. We can then probe Granny's device by giving it lots of addition problems. We can look at its performance profile, how fast it solves problems, and the errors it's susceptible to make. By looking at its performance profile, we can test our hypotheses about which algorithms it's using. Mar's third level is called the implementation level. Even if we're sure of which algorithm Granny's device uses, we still wouldn't know how the physical parts inside Granny's device map onto steps in that algorithm. Imagine we open Granny's device up. Inside we might find all sorts of different things. Little gears, cogwheels, pins and hammers. An implementation level description would describe the role each one of these physical parts plays in implementing the device's algorithm. How do we go about finding this implementation level description? Well, one strategy would be to keep Granny's device open and watch what changes inside it when it solves an addition problem. We could then try mapping those physical changes inside the device onto steps in its addition algorithm. Another strategy would be to intervene on the device. We might try rewiring or removing one of its components and seeing how that affects its performance. This will give a clue as to the role of that component in implementing its algorithm. Mar provides us with 3 ways in which computation can help us to explain a mysterious device. One might use computation to offer a computational level description of the device. Which function does it compute and why? An algorithmic level description. How does it compute that function? Or an implementation level description. How do the physical components of that device map onto steps in its algorithm? The puzzles we face with Granny's device are not a million miles away from the problems the cognitive scientists face when confronted by the human brain. Cognitive scientists want to know which computation the brain performs, which algorithm it uses for performing that computation, and which physical bits of the brain are relevant for implementing that computation. The techniques that cognitive scientists use to answer these questions are also structurally similar. Cognitive scientists try to understand the purpose of a particular piece of behaviour. What does that piece of behaviour aim to achieve for the brain? They fit hypotheses about algorithms that the brain is running to data about human reaction times and susceptibility to error. And they watch and intervene on the brain using a variety of experimental techniques to try and isolate the role that various physical bits of the brain play in generating behaviour. The big difference between Granny's device and the human brain is that brains are vastly more complex. The human brain is one of the most complex objects in the universe. It has over 100 billion neurons and a mind-bogglingly complex web of close to a quadrillion connections. The brain performs not one, but many different computations simultaneously, each one a great deal more complex than the addition function. Unravelling a computational description of the brain is a daunting task, yet it's a project on which significant progress has already been made.
As you probably know, there's been a lot of research recently trying to understand how the brain works, and in particular, the types of computations it might perform. A new hypothesis has emerged. The brain might be working like a probabilistic machine. At the origin of this idea is the recognition that we live in a world of uncertainty. Our environment is often ambiguous or noisy, and our sensory receptors are limited. Often, multiple interpretations are possible. In this context, the best our brain can do is to try to guess what's present in the world and what best action to take. Hermann von Helmholtz is often credited for understanding this. Studying the human eye, von Helmholtz judged it to be a very imperfect optical instrument. He then proposed that visual perception resulted from what he called the process of unconscious inference. Through this automatic process, the brain would be able to complete missing information using previous information and construct hypotheses about the world. These hypotheses would then be automatically accepted as our immediate reality. The brain would be a very sophisticated guessing machine. This idea has been formalized in recent years, taking ideas from machine learning and statistics. It is proposed that the brain works by constantly forming hypotheses or beliefs about the environment and the actions to take. Those hypotheses can be described mathematically as conditional probabilities, denoted P of the hypothesis given the data, which means the probability of the hypothesis given the data, where data represents the signals available to our senses. For example, suppose you are trying to figure out whether it's going to rain today. The data available might be the dark clouds that you can observe by the window. Statisticians have shown that the best way to compute those probabilities is to use Bayes' rule, named after Thomas Bayes. Bayes' rule states that we can get the probability P of the hypothesis given the data, which we call the posterior probability, by multiplying two other probabilities. First, P of the data given the hypothesis. Our knowledge about the probability of the data given the hypothesis. For example, how probable is it that the clouds look the way they do now when you actually know it is going to rain, which is called the likelihood, times P of the hypothesis, which we call the prior probability. This represents our knowledge about the hypothesis before we collect any new information. Here, for example, the probability that it's going to rain in a day independently of the shape of the cloud, a number which would be very different whether you live in Edinburgh or Los Angeles. The denominator, P of the data, is only there to ensure the resulting probability is comprised between 0 and 1, and can often be disregarded in the computation. In the visual system, in the same way, the hypothesis could be about the presence of a given object. For example, there's an animal following me, or the value of a given stimulus. For example, the speed of this animal is 30 kilometers per hour, while the data is the noisy visual inputs. The prior and the likelihood form an internal model of the world, a model of the world inside the brain, which is used to interpret our external environment. So how can we test if the brain is doing something like Bayesian inference? This has been the focus of a lot of experimental and theoretical research in the last 15 years. A first test is to look at how the brain combines information from different sensory modalities. Suppose, for example, that you are walking in a forest and fear that someone or an animal is following you. You can dimly see and hear some movement of the leaves on the ground. How do you figure out where the animal is located? Do you use one sensory modality more than the other? For example, only vision, or both? How does this depend on the reliability of the information available to each of the senses? Bayesian inference predicts that the optimal way to do this is to combine information from both modalities, but weighting the information according to its reliability. For example, if the visual information is much clearer than the auditory information, it should have much more impact on your experience. This can lead to illusions in situations where there is a conflict between the two modalities. In a lot of situations, it seems that the Bayesian predictions are qualitatively correct. Have a look at this. Ba, 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 ba. But now, look what happens if we change the video. Ba, 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 ba. What do you hear? Ba, 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 ba. The sound has not changed. Ba, 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 ba. This effect is known as the McGurk effect. It was discovered by accident. McGurk and his research assistant MacDonald were conducting a study on language perception in infants. They asked the technician to dub the sound of a phoneme over a video that was showing lips movement for another phoneme. Even if we know about this effect, we continue perceiving da. This shows that our brain automatically and unconsciously combines the visual and the auditory information in our perception of speech, creating a new mixture that might be very different from the initial sources of information. Sometimes, though, if the visual information is much more reliable than the auditory information, it can completely dominate our perceptual judgments. This can be seen in the compelling illusion of ventriloquism. Ventriloquism is a case of visual capture. Because the origin of the sound is uncertain, but the lips and expression of the puppet can be clearly perceived, one attributes the origin of the sound to the visual inputs, that is, to the mouth of the puppet. So in everyday life, the brain combines information from different modalities in a way that depends on their uncertainty. In the laboratory, researchers can make very precise measurements to test the validity of the Bayesian prediction. For example, they can measure the smallest differences one can perceive when comparing the size of different objects, based on vision alone or touch alone. And then compare the predictions of the Bayesian model with performance when both vision and touch can be used simultaneously. Such experiments have found that human participants behave in a way very similar to the Bayesian predictions, and have concluded that human performances are statistically optimal. These results are commonly interpreted as showing that the brain works in a way similar to a Bayesian machine. The Bayesian model predicts not only how to combine different pieces of information, but also how to incorporate prior knowledge. Such prior knowledge should be combined in terms of a prior distribution, which serves as a summary of all previous experience and which should be multiplied with incoming information. Recently, a lot of researchers are exploring this idea. If the brain uses prior beliefs, what are those? And how do they influence perception? Intuitively, it's in situations of strong uncertainty or ambiguity that we rely maximally on our previous experience. For example, if we wake up in the middle of the night and need to walk in total darkness, we are going to rely on our previous experience of the environment to guide our path. Similarly, Bayes' rule indicates that prior distributions should impact our perception maximally in situations of strong uncertainty. Therefore, a very good way to look at the brain's expectations of or assumptions is to look at these situations of strong uncertainty. Such studies reveal that our brains make assumptions all the time. I am the same height here as I am over here, but here I look much taller. How does that work? When trying to estimate size, you make the assumption that the room is cubic and the ceiling is parallel to the floor. This assumption makes sense because most rooms are designed this way. But here, this is not the case. The room is actually trapezoidal and the ceiling is not parallel to the floor. The reality that we perceive is consistent with our expectations, but not with the actual physical world. We make such assumptions all the time. For example, we expect that light comes from above us and interpret shadows as such. Objects to be symmetrical, to change smoothly in space and time, orientations to be more frequently horizontal or vertical, and angles to look like perpendicular corners. We also expect objects to bulge outward more than inward, that background images are colored in a uniform way, that objects move slowly or not at all, that the gaze of other people is directed towards us, and that faces correspond to convex surfaces. This is illustrated by this classical illusion known as the holomask illusion. What you see here is a concave mask of the face of Albert Einstein, that is the interior of the mask. However, we perceive it as a convex face with the nose bulging outward instead of inward. Our expectations that faces bulge outward is so strong that it counters 3D cues and depth cues. As for the McGurk effect, knowing about the illusion doesn't help. The interpretation chosen by the brain is automatic and unconscious and can't be modulated voluntarily. Why would the brain use such assumptions? These assumptions make sense because most objects in the world conform those expectations. Light comes from above, noses always stick out, objects are often static or move slowly. In that sense, using these assumptions will lead to the best guess about the environment, and we can think about them as being optimal. However, in situations of strong uncertainty, or when the objects don't conform the average statistics, using these expectations can lead to illusions. We will then tend to perceive reality as being more similar to what we expect than it really is. Objects will be seen as being slower, more symmetrical, or maybe smoother in space and time, etc. The Bayesian approach helps formalizing these ideas in a quantitative way. The idea has emerged that visual illusions were not due to the limitations of a collection of imperfect hacks that the brain would use, but rather to the result of a coherent computational strategy that is optimal under reasonable assumptions. For some researchers, because they correspond to the brain making very sensible assumptions in a situation of uncertainty, visual illusions could be viewed, paradoxically, as optimal percepts. A lot of very important questions remain. Where do those prior beliefs come from? How do we learn them? Are they the same for everybody? How do they depend on our previous experience? And can we unlearn, for example, that light shines from above, or that noses stick outward and not inward? Such questions are the focus of current research. Experimental work shows that our brains create prior expectations automatically and unconsciously all the time. We collect information about our environment and try to use it to predict what could come next. Current work also shows that our brain can update even its more natural assumptions, such as the assumption that light comes from above. This shows that our brain constantly revises its assumptions and updates its internal model of the world. The idea that the brain would work like a probabilistic machine is not restricted to perception, but has been applied to all domains of cognition. In particular, Bayesian models could be very useful for psychiatry. It's very early days for understanding mental illness. However, recent research shows that Bayesian models could be very useful for quantifying differences between groups, for example, patients versus controls, and for understanding whether those differences come from different internal models, for example, different prior beliefs, or differences in learning or decision strategies. Ultimately, this may help drug discovery. In the study of schizophrenia, for example, recent work shows that patients differ from controls in some probabilistic inference tasks. One such task is called the beads task. In this task, you have two jars. One jar contains 85% green beads and 15% blue beads. In the other jar, there are 85% blue beads and 15% green beads. Your task is to tell me from which jar come the beads that I'm drawing at random. So now I'm going to cover the jars, mix them, and I'm going to draw a bead at a time from the same jar. Your task is to tell me when you think you have received enough information to tell me from which jar those beads come from. Now, need one more bead. Another one? Or can you decide now? Schizophrenic patients are more likely than controls to make a decision after a very small number of observations, like 1 or 2 draws, and to report being certain about their decision after only 1 draw. This tendency to jump to conclusions is thought to be crucial for understanding delusions and paranoia. Researchers use mathematical models of decision tasks like this to understand patients' decision processes. A common idea in psychiatry is also that the internal models used by patients, in particular their prior beliefs or expectations, could be different from those of healthy subjects, or maybe too strong or too weak. This could explain why the patients experience the world differently. Ultimately, Bayesian modeling might also help diagnosis. Mental illness is usually measured using questionnaires or classifications such as DSM-5, which is used by clinicians and psychiatrists. Computational modeling, coupled with behavioral measurements such as in the bead task or other games, offer a different way to quantify differences between patients and healthy controls and the internal beliefs people's brains are working with. So finally, you must be wondering how our brain can do the sophisticated computations. Bayesian models are very useful for describing perception and behavior at the computational level, as Mark explained. How those algorithms are implemented in the brain is still very unclear. In fact, it is still quite debated whether Bayesian models can make predictions for neurobiology in terms of which areas of the brain would be involved and how Bayes' rule or the terms of these equations would be implemented. But this is the focus of current research.
Hi, my name's Andy Clark. I'm a professor of philosophy working at the University of Edinburgh in the School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences. My own particular interests lie in the philosophy of cognitive science, that's to say, the sciences that study the mind, and within that area in what's known as the study of embodied cognition. Embodied cognition is all about the huge difference that having an active body and being situated in a structured environment make to the kind of tasks that the brain has to perform in order to support adaptive success. This kind of work provides a useful antidote to the increasingly neurocentric vision that we encounter in contemporary media. For example, it often seems as if we've learned all we need to know about spatial navigation, or perhaps about falling in love, when we learn which bits of the brain are doing what when we exhibit those kinds of capacities. In fact, though, for most interesting capacities that biological agents exhibit, they turn upon a complex interplay between what the brain's doing and what the body is doing, bringing new percepts into the processing arena, and what we do out there in the world. Given that my interests lie squarely in embodied cognition in these ways, I'm very fortunate to be working here at the University of Edinburgh, where we have an internationally famous robotics program. Robotics, of course, is one of the key places where brain, body and world come together. Within that program, a leading figure is my co-presenter in this particular session, Professor Barbara Webb.
Hi, I'm Barbara Webb and I work in the Institute for Perception, Action and Behaviour. And my group is interested particularly in minimal minds, in how much or indeed how little brain might be needed to make a robot do intelligent things or to explain adaptive behaviour in humans or other animals. And in fact, when we start to look at this in a robot perspective, we sometimes find that you don't need a brain at all. A classic example of this are the passive dynamic walking machines built at Cornell University. This robot has no motors or controllers, but rather its motion is begun by falling forward on the slight slope, and this makes one of its legs swing forward by pendulum motion. That foot contacts the ground, the other leg swings forward, and so on. And as you can see, this produces a very natural walking gait, much more like a human walking gait than many well-known humanoid robots. There are other physical tricks that contribute to this smooth walking. Just like humans, there's a knee structure that stops the leg bending forward but allows it to bend backwards, providing foot clearance during the swing. The feet themselves are curved to make each step smooth, and there is a counterbalancing swing of the arms. So, understanding and actually building the physical system tells us more about how we walk than trying to introspectively think about how we move our legs, swing the foot forward, etc. And in fact, trying to think about how you walk tends to make you walk worse. You should try that for yourself. So the first message really is that taking the physical into account is always important. But on the other hand, obviously there is something going on inside us when we walk. There's lots of unconscious sensory processing, picking up the visual cues, the feedback from our feet about what we're walking over so that we can handle difficult terrain, go up steps, avoid obstacles. But of course, there's also inside us some intention. We're walking somewhere for some reason. So are we then more than just machines?
As a philosopher working in this area, I feel like it's my duty at this point just to pause to remind ourselves of how strange and interesting the mind and the mental really are. If you think about a volcano when it erupts, it just does what it does. It's just part of the physical order, behaving in a way that doesn't seem to require us to think about what it believes, what it hopes, what it desires, not even what it perceives. When the volcano erupts and interrupts my family vacation, I don't think that the volcano planned to erupt on that day, believed that I was starting the vacation that day, desired to interrupt my vacation. On the other hand, when I go to the fridge to get a beer, you may watch my behaviour and say, Andy believed there was a beer in the fridge, desired to drink the beer, and so went to the fridge. Similarly, when I observe the behaviour of my cat chasing a mouse, I think, hey, my cat perceived the location of the mouse, in some sense desired to catch and eat the mouse, and engaged in a very successful piece of predatory behaviour. So even at those low levels, it seems as if to understand perception and action in a natural order, we need to understand how creatures can exhibit seemingly sensible bits of behaviour on the basis of information that they take in from the world. In that sense, they seem to be fundamentally unlike volcanoes, and therefore it's not quite so clear how many neat tricks we need to understand how that kind of behavior can be produced.
Indeed, most humans, animals, and robots do use perception of the world to perform their complex tasks. But we should resist the urge to assume that that means something really complicated is going on inside the animal, that it has to make an explicit plan about what's out there in the world and what it needs to do. Very often we find it's still the case that embodiment can solve much of the problem and simplify the problem that the mind is left with to solve. So already we have the example that when walking to the fridge, Andy doesn't have to remember anything about how to swing his legs back and forth or how to get through doorways. That's done mostly by his physical system. And for the cat, in fact, its physical perception system is tuned specifically to look for fast, small-moving objects. And if you try with a laser pointer, they find that more attractive than a mouse, even though it's not going to be any good to eat in the end. So another example that we've been looking at in our own research is the behavior of desert ants who don't follow chemical trails, but nevertheless can navigate through complex environments. These ants forage in very hot climates and need to move rapidly. They use a combination of navigation strategies that include dead reckoning and visual memory. In this example, the ant is using its previous experience of returning along this route through the complex vegetation to find its way back to its nest, which is just a small hole in the ground that could be tens of meters away. Up till now, it has been assumed that ants and other creatures would have to recall each of the positions along a route to decide where to go next. But in fact, the behavior can be mimicked by a robot that never knows where it is. Instead, it simply alters the size of its zigzag proportionally to how unfamiliar its current heading appears. In other words, if things look familiar, it is probably heading the right way and can continue straight on. If they don't look familiar, it should swing around until it sees some view that it saw before and head that way. In fact, it doesn't even distinguish individual objects as objects, but just processes its low-resolution vision as a direct holistic memory, simply classifying everything it sees at the moment as, yes, I've seen this before, or no, this is unfamiliar. Note that this whole method exploits the fact that ants walk forwards, and so the direction in which it views a scene and stores that scene in memory is the same direction that it needs to take to repeat the route. Actually, the ant has a number of other adaptations that allow it to find its way efficiently. For example, the top part of its eye is sensitive to polarized light, and this allows it to detect the polarization pattern that's in the skylight. From this, it can actually deduce the position of the sun, even when the sun is not visible, if it's hidden by clouds, for example, and use this as a very reliable compass cue so that it can go in the direction that it has recalled and learnt. Biology is actually full of examples like this, where the physical structure is actually designed to solve the problem for us, and we can use those things in robotics as well.
So in many ways, it's no surprise that nature has been able to find these interesting, efficient solutions to problems. After all, brains and the bodies that they in some sense control have co-evolved. It's not the case that the brain has to evolve a control strategy for a body that is just parachuted in from nowhere. Instead, the reliable properties of the body are always present during the evolutionary time period in which the brain is evolving. It's interesting in the same sort of way to start to think about the reliable properties of the environment, because after all, those are present while the brain and the body are evolving in just the same way. So a favourite example of mine, an example that shows the kind of delicate matching between brain, body and environment, is the swimming capacities of the bluefin tuna. The bluefin tuna is a prodigious swimming machine that can go very fast, can turn rapidly, can blast off very successfully from a standing start. But it turns out that when you examine the actual pure physical capacities of the fish, I must say I'm not entirely sure how these get to be measured, but somehow when you measure the actual capacities of the fish to do things like turn and blast off through the water, it turns out that the fish itself is too weak by a factor of about 7 to turn as fast as it does, to blast off as quickly as it does, and so on. So in a series of interesting studies, starting at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and continuing at Olin College, scientists have been looking at the swimming capacities of the tuna. It turns out that what the tuna does is to make the most of its watery environment. A tuna will make the most of currents that are available, stepping into currents to go faster. But more interestingly than this, it will actively flap its tail to create small vortices in the water, which it then steps into in order to blast off more efficiently, to turn more quickly, and so on. So these kinds of story about how the tuna works have been tested at MIT and now at Olin using a robot tuna coated with lycra and performing in large watery environments. And some of this work has now led to a new generation of submarines that exploit properties like this.
Notice that the tuna is making very short-term changes to its immediate environment to improve its swimming, to get energy back from its environment to work better. But in fact, many creatures make long-term, far-reaching changes to their environments. And this can structure the world to make their interaction with the world more successful. So let's look at an example of this, another example with ants, this time of collective behavior. So these ants are just moving to a new nest, normally a crack in the rock, but in this case made by 2 slides so we can see what they're doing. They start by bringing in the eggs from their previous nest, and each of the eggs exudes an odor, so the more they place eggs at the rear of the nest, the more the odor is spread and the gradient is clearer, and it becomes easier for more ants to bring more eggs, and so they very quickly build up this collection of eggs. But they also have to build a little wall across the entrance to the nest to guard themselves, and this is made of lots of particles that the ants are picking up. So how do they build this wall? Well, again, they just use simple cues. Each ant running around will pick up a particle if it runs into it. If it's then running with a particle, crosses the nest entrance, going towards the gradient of this odor from the eggs, it will drop the particle where it is. Other ants running around with particles will run into a particle on the ground, and they'll just drop the particle when they run into another particle. So between these 2 behaviors, these 2 simple rules, they'll actually start to build a wall, because the first rule will seed the wall in a particular place, just near the nest entrance. And the second rule will mean that as a wall is built, the wall will get bigger, because there's just a feedback of the particles already there, causing more particles to be deposited. So the ants will continue until they have a wall and can add no more. And in fact, we can show that this really works by programming some simple robots to do just these 2 behaviors. So in this case, the robots use a gradient of light instead of an odor, and they can detect a line on the ground instead of the nest entrance. But otherwise, they're doing just what the ants were doing. They're picking up the particles when they run into them. They drop the particle if they cross the line going towards the light. And they drop the particle if they run into another particle already on the ground. And as you can see through this sort of time lapse of the robots running around, they very quickly build a successful wall, just like the ants did. So we can see this kind of behavior even in larger, interesting structures, such as the mounds built by termites or complex birds' nests. And in general, it's a principle that this interaction with the world structures the world itself and makes any kind of complex task easier.
So far, a lot of the complexity that we've been observing has been in the system's interactions with the world. But the reasonable question at this point will be, how does all this scale up to higher cognition? How does it scale up to thinking, reasoning, planning, having concepts that give you a grip upon your world? In one way, we can see that the structured human-built environment provides many of the same opportunities as the simpler environments that we've been looking at, the environment for the ants, for example. Think of Wikipedia entries. In the case of Wikipedia, we create structure in the world, different people add to the structure, and the way that they add to the structure changes the way that other people add to the structure. At the same time, though, there's a real question about how all that kind of knowledge gets into us in the first place. Fortunately, there's also substantial evidence that embodied interaction simplifies learning. A nice example is the BabyBot work coming out of Genoa from the lab of Giorgio Metta and colleagues. So in the case of BabyBot, BabyBot uses its own actions to help it learn about the world. It can see its own arm in its field of vision, and it's good at detecting motion. It sweeps its arm across the field of vision, and if it encounters an object, then the sort of unique signature of motion, of increased motion that is produced at that moment, is a cheap way of knowing that BabyBot has encountered an object, that these are the boundaries of the object, and so on. So you can imagine the sort of the change in the motion flow when you encounter an object, and on it goes. Another example in the same sort of area is just the general use of robotic interactions with the world to create rich time-locked patterns of multimodal self-stimulation. So if I poke and pull and shove at the world, then I can make objects move around. Sometimes I can make them make noises. Sometimes I can bring them close to my face so that I can smell them. These time-locked patterns of multimodal response from the objects in the world are a good clue, again, that we are precisely encountering objects, the kind of thing that it's probably worth bringing into our conceptual repertoire. So the general hope hereabouts is that patterns of embodied interaction with the world provide a kind of way in, a sort of developmental trajectory in which concepts, the building blocks of higher cognition, can begin to come into focus.
To illustrate these ideas about concepts, we can think about what it might take to allow a robot to recognize a chair. Chairs come in so many different sizes, colors, constructions, that there's no simple list of properties that we could make that allow us to have a visual system simply know that something is a chair or not a chair. But nevertheless, we can look at an object and almost instantly assess, is this a chair or is it not a chair? James Gibson in the 1950s argued that what we're really understanding by a chair is the concept of sittability. It's about understanding the object as something that we can interact with in a particular way. This object is something that will support our weight and allow us to bend in the right places to be able to sit on it. And that we acquire this concept through thousands of interactions with the world, with real chairs and other objects that we find we're capable of sitting on. So if we follow this line of argument, it means that to make a robot recognize a chair in the same way that we do, it would have to have the same capability to sit on things, the same ability to find out through its own experience what will or will not support its weight, what will or will not allow it to bend in the appropriate places to sit. Now, importantly, I'm not arguing that when we recognize something as a chair, we have to actually go through this process of sitting on it, but rather that through our experience, we build up an internal model of the actions, the interactions that occur when we actually sit on something. And that we can then, in our imagination, when looking at some new object, decide if this is something that we think we should be able to sit on or not. And this is the essence of what these concepts are. If we now look perhaps more generally at robots and robots getting around in the world, take, for example, the Urban Challenge robots, which were robots embedded in cars who had to drive around a real urban environment, interacting with other cars, dealing with intersections, with road signs and so forth. Their success was really supported by a key factor, and that is having multi-layer control systems where the lowest levels of the control system involve this direct interaction with the world, keeping the wheels on the road, detecting if a collision is about to occur, tracking moving objects and making appropriate evasive actions. All those things were happening at this lowest level, and that frees up the higher levels, the conceptual levels, for the robot to then think about more abstract, important plans, such as how to get from A to B. So in planning a route from one part of the city to another, we don't want to have to take into account the possible location of every single moving object around us and whether that might intersect with our path. We don't even want to have to think about the exact curvature of the roads that we're following, but rather we want to have an abstract map of where we want to go, and we rely on the fact that at the lowest levels, when we want to drive down a road, we have sensory systems that allow us to do the immediate interaction that keeps us on the road and allows us to see a moving object and avoid it. So it's this idea of abstracting away the internal model from the real world interaction that's really key. But of course, it can't be too abstract. It has to be grounded in the world, in our experience with the world, in learning from the world, so that we stay in sync with the world, so to speak.
So one more time, the philosopher feels that they have to come in and raise the spectre of higher cognition. So we've been hearing a lot about maintaining an ongoing interaction with the world, structuring that ongoing interaction across many layers. But when we think about at least the caricature representations of cognition that we encounter in the media or just in art, what we typically see is a representation of somebody just thinking. So think about Rodin's thinker, kind of sitting there like that or something. Cartoon characters where suddenly the little light bulb goes off over their head. Or just the general image of you sitting in the bath having a sudden moment of revelation. Nonetheless, I think if we actually pause to reflect on what most of real-world higher cognition looks like, it actually doesn't look like that at all. That's not to say that those things don't happen, but in general, when we're engaged in higher cognitive processing, thinking, reasoning, planning our family vacation, thinking about the unfolding of the economy over the next 10 or 20 years, what we do is we sit in crowded offices surrounded by desktop machines, smartphones of one kind or another, pen, paper, graphs, all kinds of equipment. And it's the human brain and the human organism immersed in that sea of equipment which seems to be, in most daily cases, the real thinking machine. A nice simple example is just the use of pen and paper to do long multiplication. In a case like that, using routines that we've acquired at school, we basically reduce a complicated piece of problem solving to a sequence of smaller pieces of problem solving that brains like ours can easily comprehend. So you take the long multiplication, you turn it into lots of short multiplications with results stored in an external buffer on the page. This seems to me to be quite a good model of how an awful lot of human cognition actually operates in the wild. In this kind of way, you might think that the structures that we place around ourselves are for us something like the watery environment for the tuna. This is the environment with which we interact, and those interactions simplify the problems that brains like ours need to solve, even in the domain of higher cognition. So I think the moral of all of this really is that we do need to avoid, even in the case of higher cognition, what you could think of as the naked brain fallacy, the fallacy of assuming that all the interesting cognitive action is always going on in the brain, rather than being spread in delicate and often hard to understand ways between what the brain's doing, what the body's doing, and what the manipulable external world makes available.
So where does that leave us? Our conclusion is that we should not think of minds as disembodied computers in charge of meat machines, but rather as completely integrated and intermingled with our physical capacities and our interactions with the world. And that means to create artificial minds, we'll have to build systems that are embodied and that develop and learn inside robot bodies. So that's my job. And for philosophers like Andy, the essential message is to keep the body in mind.